Okay, I think we can get started, and then welcome others as they join. So good morning, everybody. I think it's morning for most of you joining here today. My name is Cesar Jaramillo. I'm the executive director at Project Ploughshares. I'm also the chair of the Canadian Pugwash Group, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this session of the series on Canada and the abolition of nuclear weapons that Project Ploughshares has organized throughout the year. This is the last module in the series, and it is thanks to the generous support of the Shantz Mennonite Church Bequest Fund that we are able to put together and organize these events on nuclear disarmament this year, and we're very grateful for that support. And it is very encouraging to see that there is interest from the faith community in many of these issues that concern us all. We are very grateful that and fortunate that today joining me, we're going to have Julie Clark, an expert from the Balsillie School of International Affairs, who has given a lot of thought to these issues of nuclear weapons, nuclear disarmament, the normative regime upon which these discussions are being held, and she's going to share some perspectives as well in the course of this module. The general topics are in a way a bit of a conclusion from the thematic focus areas that we have had in the earlier events of this series of Canada and the abolition of nuclear weapons. And in a way, the progression of the topics that we have addressed in the webinars is a mirror of the progression of the issues related to nuclear disarmament and nuclear abolition efforts throughout this year. So needless to say, we have acknowledged and reflected upon the crisis in Ukraine, which we will touch upon again here today. We have looked at some of the main processes related to nuclear disarmament that have taken place this year, including, of course, the 10th Review Conference of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and the first meeting of states parties of the excuse me, the 10th Review Conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the first meeting of states parties of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And we're always in the back of our minds, and today very explicitly thinking about Canada, where how to bring that conversation home and how to formulate recommendations for our government to implement and to have a positive impact in nuclear disarmament conversations. A premise here is that we feel that Canada has the right attributes to have a positive impact on the world stage and on the nuclear disarmament conversations. But of course, we ask the question whether Canada is actually pulling its weight, and if so, if it's pulling it in the right direction. But we'll get to that in a minute. We are recording this session as we have other sessions, and this is to produce summary reports of the whole series, which all participants will be receiving in due course, so that you have a record of the conversations that have taken place, even those that you have not been able to attend. It will be a consolidated report, and you can look forward to that. The intent of the session today is to have a conversation involving some perspectives by myself, by Julie, and we encourage everyone joining to post questions and write comments in the Q&A function, in the comments function of the Zoom platform. And after some initial remarks, we want to engage in those questions that are coming to your minds, and we're going to do our best to entertain them and address them. We're grateful to have my colleague and friend Kelsey Gallagher joining here to provide support, and he will be helping us out when we get to the Q&A part of the discussion. The two general topics that we wish to reflect upon today are related to the Ukraine crisis, the latest developments related to this conflict, and secondly, bringing it once again to Canada, to the very specific question of what can Canada do, and is Canada well positioned to undertake some of these recommendations, and if it is well positioned and is not undertaking them, then of course ask the question why that might be the case. But in case in the but let's start with some reflections on the Ukraine crisis, and of course we are all aware by now that there is a clear and present risk of nuclear weapons use in the context of the Ukraine crisis, and the fact that this has been widely recognized may present a silver lining in as much as it reflects the fragility and the insanity and the high risks inherent to nuclear deterrence policy. But as I have argued in other contexts, and at Project Ploughshares, we have made the case, reprehensible and shocking and meriting condemnation as Russia's explicit nuclear threats may be, they are hardly surprising. I think there would be an equally or very similarly high threat of use of nuclear weapons in the context of the Ukraine crisis, even if Russia and President Putin and Medvedev had not explicitly verbalized the nuclear threats. Because even if these comments are irresponsible and merit rejection and may exacerbate the tensions themselves, the reality is that the nuclear risk existed even before these words were uttered by Russia, that they were going to place their nuclear weapons on high alert, that they reserve the right to use them, or that the reinforcing the point that it is not a bluff. The reason, as we have argued, that it is not a bluff is because that is the basis of nuclear deterrence doctrine, a version of which is shared by all states that possess nuclear weapons. So once again, this is what deterrence looks like. This has been a theoretical conversation for many years and many decades, and we have to realize that this is exactly what nuclear deterrence looks like. And the specter of nuclear weapons is not being materialized today because Russia has verbalized it, even if, once again, and I cannot emphasize enough, these are reprehensible statements that must be rejected, and that crystallize the responsibility of nuclear weapons threats. But these risks existed before Russia verbalized them. These are threats that are inherent, so to the policies of nuclear deterrence. So in a way, few should be surprised that the specter of nuclear weapons has risen, because I think by definition it would have, under any circumstances, when you have Russia on the one hand and a block of countries, including at least 3 nuclear weapons possessors, supporting the other side against which. So of course the specter and the risk of nuclear disaster will be present in such a scenario. And this scenario, a key point that I would highlight at this point, is that it's being characterized by severe and profound uncertainty. It is, and this is itself a reflection of the fragility of nuclear deterrence doctrines, again, shared by all parties to this conflict. At the end of the day, no one knows what might happen, what the relative risk of nuclear weapons use is in the next few days and weeks and months. Everyone acknowledges that there's a risk out there. Everyone acknowledges that it would be catastrophic if nuclear weapons were used. But depending on whom you read, whether it's pundits or media or government people or civil society, some might place more bets on the rationality of Vladimir Putin, on the sense that it would be suicidal. Others point to the actual risk of the scenario, of certain scenarios that they might actually be used. Some differentiate between using in Ukraine versus using in against a NATO member. But at the end of the day, it is mostly based on speculative assessments, and that again is an unacceptable level of fragility and uncertainty around this very grave threat. So in that context, I think the international community must urgently focus on solutions that will remove the specter of the possibility of nuclear weapons use in the next weeks and days. And these solutions must be practical, realistic, pragmatic, and feasible. So in this context, I have seen many assessments recently by very authoritative groups and individuals about where the solutions might lie in terms specifically of de-escalating the tensions and trying to move away from the risk of nuclear catastrophe. But I find that many of these assessments are too big picture and miss the immediacy of the nuclear weapons threat right now. So we see, for example, very welcome proposals about reviving the Open Skies Treaty, about about Russia and the United States engaging earnestly in the continuation of New START, about taking some lessons from the discussions at the NPT on nuclear risk reduction. And these are all welcome initiatives, about joining the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and taking this opportunity as a catalyst to rally more countries to join the TPNW, of which we're very supportive at Project Ploughshares. And these are all, even though these are welcome initiatives, these are longer-term conversations, each of which may take years to really carry out and fulfill. So I would make a plea for immediate practical solutions that look at the reality on the battlefield today and specifically address the question of how to avoid situations and circumstances and scenarios in which Russia might be, or any party to this conflict might feel compelled to use nuclear weapons. All countries that possess nuclear weapons share, even though the formulation varies slightly from country to country, the mantra has long been that by their very possession, they reserve the right of using them under certain narrow circumstances. And these narrow circumstances generally relate to the vital security of the states, to the continuation of government, to rejecting any efforts to alter the existence of the state as it exists today. So I think knowing that, we need to clarify, we, like the international community, all parties to this conflict, need to be very clear about what the goals are and about what the goals are not. And in the latter category, what the goals are not, I think that we need to rule out specifically the scenarios in which realistically the use of nuclear weapons could be not just invoked, but indeed materialized. One last comment, and then we'll hear from Julie some perspectives on the Ukraine. It is that it is often said that a silver lining to this crisis is, and I've said it myself, that a silver lining to this crisis is the realization of the insanity of nuclear deterrence doctrine, of the insanity of conflicts where there might be escalation to the use of nuclear weapons. And that is true, but it's also a bit of, admittedly, a bit of wishful thinking, that is the silver lining, that there will indeed be such a realization, that this close call will steer the international community in another direction towards disarmament and toward the abolition of nuclear weapons. But we're not sure yet. Generally speaking, there are two broad scenarios that may follow from this crisis. On the one hand, ideally, it would be a silver lining to realize the fragility and the insanity and how the danger of these close calls, and undertake measures to really move away from a security relationship between the East and the West that relies on the annihilation of humanity and on the use of nuclear weapons. But that is not guaranteed. The other path, which I fear there is at least a certain possibility of, the other path is to redouble on nuclear deterrence, to redouble on the rhetoric of increased military spending, to further militarize relations between the East and the West in such a way that in not so many years, similar conditions where the use of nuclear weapons may seem again to be seen as justified by one party or another. So we're at a juncture, we're at a critical juncture, and I fear that the international community may end up drawing all the wrong conclusions, and rather than building common security, it may actually redouble on its militaristic approach to East-West relations, including modernization and buildup of nuclear deterrence capabilities. So I'll hand it over to Julie for some comments on this.
Thanks, Cesar, and also thank you for having me here today, and to having all those that are attending. It's lovely to have you attending as well. Some of the comments that you were just mentioning, the first one is the reinforcement of the doctrine surrounding deterrence is extremely important to remember. Deterrence itself by nature is the threat of a use of the weapons, and it's the restraint of not using them is the fear of retaliation that's applied to them. And so this is a real threat. This isn't something that we can sweep under the rug any longer. And I think this tension that has been brewing in the last year is a very good reminder of this. The other thing, of course, it is always important that we have practical solutions going forward. Yes, the long-term ones are extremely important. These open skies treaties and then also New START, particularly the bilateral agreements, have been very important for the arms reduction component of nuclear weapons, as much as the multilateral treaties have as well. And it's always important to remember to search for hope in all of it, because without it, then we are engaging with a world that is much darker than we can go forward with. In terms of the current threat environment in Ukraine, it is still very high. Particularly, there's risks that have been indicated over the past years, presented itself once again in a peril situation when there has been increased shelling this past weekend in southern area of Ukraine, where the Zaporizhzhia plant sits. That's only about 500 kilometers from the Chernobyl 1986 nuclear accident site. And the risk of shelling and stability of the Russian occupied plant has increased off and on throughout the past 3 months, along with rolling blackouts where the safety procedures of that plant are dependent upon a generator. The professionals, the scientists and the engineers, are in high risk and high stress situations. That's not ideal for running a nuclear plant of the size that it is. It's one of the largest in Europe. And as well, we have landmines that have been placed around the plant, and of course the shelling that has increased this past week as well. My concern with the Ukrainian crisis specifically has been in large part that nuclear plant, because accidents are extremely possible. And if an accident happened with that Zaporizhzhia plant, it would be about 6 times that of Chernobyl. And so it's extremely important that we find some sort of solution for diplomacy and to calm the waters of what is occurring in Ukraine at this moment. Additionally, we're also engaging with a new security status quo going forward. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg informed the global community recently that we need to prepare for the long haul with this war that is occurring, and that it's not likely to end anytime soon. The comment was backed even further at the Halifax International Security Forum this past weekend by U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, who proclaimed that we are heading to a world of tyranny and turmoil. This is not ideal for us to move forward, and also it makes diplomacy extremely hard as we continue to move forward as well. Then we're adding in the heightened nuclear anxiety amongst the public, in which we've been forced to engage once more with the possibility of nuclear war. This threat hasn't really been at the forefront for Canadians since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, a moment that most baby boomers will remember very clearly. The uncertainty of it all is paired with having to deal with the threat of nuclear fallout or annihilation, and it is not a concept that most people are comfortable with engaging in. In fact, there's a concept by Robert Lifton following the bombing in Japan in 1945, in which no fault to the public engaged in a phenomenon called public psychic numbing. The concept behind this is that the reality is so horrific that the mind, in order to protect itself, numbs the reality of the situation and either makes it seem less important or non-existing. We as a global community have had to deal with a lot these past few years, and the nuclear threat may be that one thing that's a bit too much for most to handle. But we need to stay vigilant, because the tension has not diminished, but rather has proceeded and in some cases have increased. I've been asked before regarding ebbs and flows of nuclear threat and rhetoric coming primarily from Russia in the past year. And while there are moments in which Putin has pulled back on his comment, the threat is also bigger than the words that are made by the leaders themselves. And there's no better moment that has depicted it than the recent determined accidental bombing of Poland. That was the area right by the Ukrainian border, and reminder that Poland is a NATO member. Last week on the 15th, in which the 24-hour media cycle, both the social and traditional, were touting about the enactment of Article 5 and also the concern of World War III. The proper procedures of discussions amongst the Polish security officials, NATO members, and also the resulting investigation that has proceeded was able to calm those waters and but it's really important to remember that those 24 hours demonstrated perfectly why this conversation is so important. When something like this occurs, as it definitely can in a conflict zone, the risk is much higher when nuclear weapons are hanging in the balance of potential use. Again, I'll remind the audience that deterrence as a concept at the core is built with the threat of potentially using them. Refusal to use them is based on a fear of retaliation. It also requires reliable leaders to choose the alternative path to the use. And so we're really putting a lot of faith that the leaders will choose the right decision. So instead of phrasing the current tension as an ebb and flow, I'll say that it's unfortunately closer to an escalation ladder. So this is a concept that is coined by Herman Kahn from his studies on the Cold War. And the idea is that the threat is made, then we accept that tension, and we move to the next rung on the ladder. And then, of course, the last rung on the ladder is the use of that nuclear weapon. Now, the hope is that we go back down the ladder or off it altogether. But it's important to remember that the threat is continuing, even when words have been backtracked. It doesn't mean that the threat has disappeared. I'm also adding that there's been a renewed arms race based on modernizing the nuclear stockpile and delivery system. Particularly, the United States Defense Department has committed about $600 billion through to 2030. And other nuclear weapon states have increased their modernizing programs, building silos and their stockpiles in this past year. The risk, as I said, is still very high. This is unfortunately being met with a trend of lower levels of transparency. And we are currently, according to SIPRI, sitting at about 12,705 weapons in the world. I recognize that not all of them are operable, but there is an estimation of 9,440 that are ready for military use. The reminder that really only one or two are necessary to make the point. And along with that lower level of transparency is a seemingly entrenchment in the security status quo and a shaky willingness to engage in good faith with disarmament debates surrounding nuclear weapons, particularly NATO having extreme and understandably concerned with the mounting tensions that are occurring as well. This makes Canada's involvement in the nuclear question and conversation, whether it be disarmament or reduction, remarkably difficult for the country to address. It is a reminder to the audience here, because I don't want to end this segment on such a dark note, that there are always people in the background who are working day and night, 24/7, to make sure that the worst doesn't happen. It has happened. It's been the case before, and it is still the case now. Also, we need to continue this conversation, and this conversation is going to require all members of the community, academics, activists, diplomats, policymakers, and military officials, as they are crucial to the conversation regarding nuclear weapons. And it also needs to be a multi-generational commitment, recognizing that every generation has its strengths, because it really is up to not only the baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z, who have their strengths, as I said, going forward, but it's up to all of us to work together to find a different path forward for the generations that are about to come. Because the way we seem to be heading is not something we should just accept and be comfortable with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie, and we are open to questions. Please feel free to use, and indeed you're encouraged to use a Q&A function. But I just want to quickly react to a couple of things you said, and I love the way you ended. You know, I think we are in a warring trajectory, and we need to really devise, you know, new ways of thinking and new approaches to resolve these crises. I think, I mean, this you mentioned the Halifax Forum and some statements that have been made there. I mean, and this notion that this conflict that we need to be ready for a long-winded conflict that will, you know, that will that will have perhaps a longer duration than many of us would hope, is itself a dangerous formulation, a dangerous
Yeah.
proposition. Each day that the conflict continues, it's a day where there is a risk, a real risk of escalation into the use of nuclear weapons. And each day the West is even though it portrays, it says officially it's not a party to the conflict, it says away the West is having a deeper influence in the conduct of this conflict and in its outcome with the provision of arms to Ukraine. And we'll see, where how Russia will respond, especially if this provision of arms to Ukraine ultimately changes the calculus of
Yeah.
Russia and the direction of the conflict in such a way where Russia may feel that the conditions, as I said at the start, the conditions where it might feel justified to use nuclear weapons are present, however reprehensible that analysis may be. I welcome your comment on diplomacy. I think we need to redouble diplomacy, and as we have argued at Project Ploughshares as well before, we reject the view that diplomacy should be understood to be strictly a reward for good behavior, and that when times are tense and you cut off the diplomatic engagement. We believe it is exactly when tensions are running high that diplomacy can serve its greatest purpose, and that diplomacy should be insisted upon and pursued. So I think that should be clear, and therein lies a role for Canada. We can talk about Canada in greater detail later, but in keeping that diplomatic option open. And just on the nuclear ladder or the escalation ladder, absolutely, there's the possibility of escalation, but just to remind folks that this is neither predictable nor linear. There's no there. The conversations about deterrence have been largely theoretical. And I think one aspect that needs to be considered is the day-to-day reality on the ground and the battlefield that may or may not create conditions, and where the linear nature may not be true. There may be leaps. There may all sorts of situations that no one really can predict. So the fragility is there. Okay.
We can move to some Q&A, Cesar, if your comments are final there. I see some questions in the chat right now. I have some questions myself, and once again, I would offer everyone, if you're have any itching question, now is the time to ask, either through the handy Q&A function or in the chat. We're a friendly bunch, so please swing away. So we have some good questions from Evelyn in the chat, right? What can the individual do? Letters to the editor, something that comes to mind obviously is as an individual, maybe contacting your member of parliament. I remember when this started this year, talking to my dad. He's in his mid-60s, and talking about, really saying to him, I do not understand how your generation lived through this constant nuclear anxiety, right? All of the time. How did you guys do it? And really back height of the Cold War, and even prior to that, there was a lot of individual engagement on the issues of the risk of nuclear annihilation. And I think in the decades since, those risks have been kind of put to the back of mind of many individuals in Canada, when of course the risk of nuclear annihilation would extend to us. So I guess the question being, and thanks for posing it, Evelyn, what can the individual do? I think one thing you can do is to continue coming to Project Ploughshares webinars like the one that you've attended today. But what is some what are some concrete steps that the individual can take? And then another question for myself on the topic of this, the escalatory ladder. Again, looking back at the beginning of the conflict, or I should say, this round of the conflict, obviously it's been going on for a number of years now in the East. But when Putin came out and said that their nuclear arsenal was placed on a higher, closer to pressing the red button, essentially, and the anxiety that came with that. Recently, if you recall, Putin made some comments in October, I believe, saying that they will not use nuclear weapons. So the question here is, once you take that step up the escalatory ladder, how easy is it to, step on the lower rung. Is this kind of a Pandora's box thing? Once you open up this level of risk and escalation is perceived to be increased, the risk of it, how easy is it to step back and say, well, we don't want nuclear war? Because I think everyone in this conflict can come to the conclusion that obviously none of us want nuclear conflict. So the question being, once you take that step up the rung through a speech act, how easy is it to take a step down? And can saying we're not going to use nukes be enough, or does there have to be an actual, some sort of material step taken? What does that look like? And I see one more from Jim. Jim, thanks so much for joining. Nuclear anxieties. Can't we conclude that mutually assured destruction deterrents have worked for the 77 years since 1945? A great question, right? Mm-hmm. Proponents of MAD theory, mutually assured destruction, would say, well, the proof is in the pudding. If this doesn't work, then wouldn't we have crossed into the territory of open nuclear conflict in the decades since these horrible weapons have entered into, been created. So, and then I see another one from Peter. So I'm going to throw out those three and get some thoughts, and then we can go back to the Q&A. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you, Kelsey, and thanks to others for posing excellent questions. I'm happy to comment, but Julie, feel free to weigh in.
Yeah. So
well.
the first thing is I'll respond to the use of the theoretical format of the escalation ladder. Often in complicated situations, particularly academics will try to create some sense of it, a situation, by making it seem linear. It does not mean that in practice that's the case. I think it's a tool to use to try and conceptualize a very complicated situation. Is it a Pandora's box? How easy it is to step down a rung? I don't want to say it's a Pandora's box. I would say that how easy it is to step down the rung, you can always go back down the ladder. The ease of it is dependent upon many factors. Within regards to perhaps Russia, there's going to be factors of the likely ability to win the war, if that's possible. They're also going to have to be thinking about their prestige internationally. NATO has to think about the strengths of the alliance, where that lies, what its future holds. And then the individual countries have to make their own decision depending on where they sit, how to go. So it may be easier for different countries or different leaders to make the decision to go back down the ladder than others. And it may be very difficult for others to make that decision because there's a lot more at stake making those decisions after making big claims. So it's situational. What can the individual do? I would say that use all the tools available. So I think an earlier question from Evelyn was asked about editors, like letters to the editor, to wake people up to the dangers. Absolutely. I would say do that. I would also say if you're going to do that to try and reach multiple different generations, I would do it in different kinds of platforms as well, not just a traditional letter to the editor, but create, maybe not Twitter at this moment, but use some form of social media to try and get towards the younger generations as well, because they absolutely need to be in this conversation. Yes, talk to your representative. I would say if you feel the confidence to go see them in person, make them realize how stressful this is, how important it is to you as one of their constituents. In terms of mutually assured destruction, we've since 1945, deterrence has worked. I'm not going to deny that has been, as Kelsey was saying, the proof in the pudding kind of thing. But I will also say that a lot of experts have said that we've been very lucky that something hasn't happened. There are many moments during the Cold War specifically in which a very different outcome could have happened. And And as I said, it has really been the luck and the right people at the right time making a different decision. And it's also the ability for those often in the science and military community to take a step back to evaluate a situation before resulting in a suggestion of an action. And so to pin our hat too much on the belief that deterrence will always work is dangerous. At some point, it is possible that our luck may run out. And the reality of what that means is horrific. It's people. It's not just buildings or land, which wouldn't be usable after it happening. It's people. And the abilities of a lot of these weapons are substantial. So yes, it hasn't happened, but I would finish that with it hasn't happened yet. And so that is why this conversation is so important.
Thank you for those thoughts, Julie. Very thoughtful comments. I concur with all of it, what you have said. Maybe to complement a little bit, I mean, on the question of the possibility of escalation, whether we call it a ladder or not, just to again reiterate, it's not linear or predictable. And just to say that declaratory policy, Kelsey, important as it is but one of the factors. Declaratory policy can help diffuse tension. It can also contribute to exacerbating said tensions, but it's only one of the factors. You said, I mean, Putin has said, Russia has said everything from high alert to it's not in anybody's interest to use nuclear weapons, so it's not a bluff. Since the conflict, not long before the conflict, all the N5, the five nuclear weapon states under the Treaty on the Prohibition of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, issued a statement on January 23rd saying that reiterating this notion that a nuclear weapons war cannot be won and must not be fought. Yet nuclear risk materialized soon thereafter. When Russia first made the first reference to nuclear weapons, the French foreign minister, and this wasn't as reported on as the Russian threats, the French foreign minister said, well, don't you forget, Mr. Putin, that we also have a nuclear deterrent. Since the war began, NATO has adopted at the June summit in Madrid, adopted its strategic concept, once again framing nuclear weapons as the supreme security guarantee and reserving scenarios under which they might actually use nuclear weapons. So yeah, declaratory, and this is important declaratory policy, and it's a good point of reference. But to go back to an earlier point, I think it's ultimately the reality on the ground which may or may not create the conditions for escalation. Many of you will be familiar with the Russell-Einstein Manifesto. Decades old. We quote it often, sometimes central to Pugwash. And one part talks about illusory hope, and it says, and I quote, "Whatever agreements not to use H-bombs had been reached in time of peace, they would no longer be considered binding in time of war." And this is, I think there's some truth to that. You can have treaties, but if the conditions where one state considers that its vital security interests are in danger, that's when we should fear that they may be tempted to use nuclear weapons. And I think in the concept of Ukraine, such scenarios may still be possible.
I was just going to quickly jump in because the chat is very live and we're getting lots of questions. Right. So I want to say thanks so much for the engagement, folks. Cesar, and feel free to engage that point in a moment. But I think we'll take maybe 3 more questions for this round of the Q&A. We have about 5 more minutes for the Q&A, and then we're going to return back to Cesar and Julie, and we will have a Q&A at the end as well. So any of the burning questions, hopefully we can get to them. So I'm just gonna
keep them coming. Yeah.
Yep. Just a potpourri here, and answer as you see fit, Julie and Cesar, please. So Peter, thanks so much for coming. Good to see you. Asking, where have you seen globally? What is the most effective and promising popular movement for peace in particular related to what we're seeing right now in Russia and Ukraine. I would actually open this up and say, perhaps in the past, right? What is, kind of civil society movements? Where have we seen really effective civil society movements to push against the threat of the use of nuclear weapons? Mr. Lingard, Matt, great to see you. Thanks so much for coming. Asking, what is the trajectory? So hypothetically, if we do see nuclear weapons deployed, whether these are strategic or tactical or whatever, what is the likely trajectory of the war after that? What would we see? And then Simri, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, but asking, so the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which of course we want to see Canada sign. If Canada signs it today, unfortunately, nukes are not going to dissolve into thin air, right? This is more of a longer term process. So what is, if you're going to, put on someone's shoes who are in power today, what can you do today as a person in power? What should we be calling on our elected officials to do to really, dissolve the risk of the nuclear threat? Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Kelsey, and thanks to all who posed these wonderful questions. And these are, the questions, the critical questions that really demand attention at this point. I'll start with, I guess, I'll try to address a little bit of Peter's. Thank you for the question, Peter, about globally, where what's happening and where can we see some effectiveness in terms of the nuclear disarmament movement. I think a couple of things on the Ukraine question. I think there's a pretty universal rejection of the possibility of nuclear weapon threat and a real abhorrence to this possibility founded on fear, on legitimate fear. So again, going back to silver lining language, there's something positive to that in the near universal. And I think even those who maybe clearly in the West, there's a lot of sympathy for the Ukrainian cause and well warranted, but even those who may be sympathetic to other grievances from the other side, whatever, I think there's some general agreement that the nuclear weapons scenario is bad news for everybody. So and therein lies the paradox. I mean, if nuclear weapons were to be used, and I don't want to sound alarmist, I'm not saying it's a likeliest scenario, but of course it's a conceivable scenario. It'd be a shame to walk into that situation, even when the premise is that there's universal agreement that nobody wants that scenario. But such is the nature of escalation, and there are scholars who devote their whole careers to studying this concept of escalation, and there is such a thing as reaching scenarios that nobody wants or intends, and nonetheless the circumstances on the ground lead you there. So we need to be very, very cautious about that. And just to address another point, and Julie can weigh in on the deterrence question, because from the previous round, because I did want to complement that. It isn't the fact that that nuclear weapons have not been used since 1945. Till today. Evidence, perhaps, that deterrence works. And I'll say, first of all, Julie is absolutely right about the luck factor. And then some authoritative scholars have explicitly said sheer dumb luck is what has prevented a nuclear catastrophe. But the question of nuclear deterrence has achieved a certain dogmatic flair, and people say things such as, I believe in nuclear deterrence, or I don't believe in nuclear deterrence, as if it were a dogma or a religion or a higher being or something. I mean, nuclear deterrence is a reality. It's a doctrine, and some people, some states and governments put a greater or lesser number of eggs on that nuclear deterrence basket, but it's often an oversimplified conversation, or people say, well, what if deterrence works 9 times out of 10, but not one? That is the end of the world. It may or may not be the end of the world, depending on circumstances, depending if the vital security interests of the states are seen to be threatened. So there's a lot to that. But in that sea of uncertainty, I think it is unacceptable. Even if they haven't been used since 1945, it's an unacceptable basis for collective security to have this sort of Damocles, as Kennedy has, former President Kennedy called it, hanging above us, this threat of of existential annihilation over us as the basis for collective security. And I think that's where the nuclear disarmament movement has landed at this stage, including the basis for the TPNW, that is unacceptable. We will not have that as the basis for security. And the obvious alternative is to formulate security arrangements that do not rely on nuclear weapons, on the possibility of nuclear weapons, and that prioritize multilateral institutions, that prioritize the rule of law, that prioritize diplomacy, that prioritize dialogue, that prioritize economic integration, etc. So again, it's hard to prove a negative or a counterfactual. You know, could we have had a catastrophe? Maybe, maybe not. We have been lucky thus far, but I think the key message is that is an unacceptable basis for collective security.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. In terms of answering some of the questions, I think the first one I want to sort of answer are, have there been effective or promising popular movement for peace? And then it's connected with related within the Russian conflict unfolding. I think not so much a popular movement, but I think a really good indicator of the universal community choosing peace is how open, with particularly in Canada, we've been to welcoming refugees. I think it's an indicator and a reminder to the global community, and quite frankly should be a reminder to our leaders as well, that at the heart of it, people want to help. And I think peace is a more natural place that we would like to place ourselves into in the future. I'm not saying that security is the contrary. I'm just saying that I believe truly that people want to choose a peaceful path intuitively. And so I think how open the community has been is an indicator of that with this particular conflict. I think also the nuclear movement needs to maybe start taking some note from some other popular movements that have existed in the last decade. I think it's time that the anti-nuclear movement needs to update itself a bit and how it messages itself, how it uses technology. And there are things to learn from the climate crisis movement that has been going on. There are things to learn even from the Black Lives Matters movement, or I don't know more as well, where it's a reminder to the individual, it's the people that are impacted in these situations. And I believe that there's a power in that. And so there's ways that we can learn going forward with popular movements as we continue to move forward. I think one of the other questions was the trajectory. It's a difficult question to answer. And I think we've kind of answered it a little bit. Cesar's already addressed it. So I will leave it at where it is. I will also say that it is, when choosing not to ignore a situation, it is easy sometimes to spiral into the hopelessness. And so I would encourage individuals to engage in hopeful engagement, and to, as hard as it may seem, to keep going back to what can we do? How can we act? Who do I need to talk to? If this is something that matters to you, what can I write? If you're a teacher or a professor, how can I have this large conversation with my students to get them excited or involved? And I think that that's a particular part of the question, is the use of the word spiral. I would say be careful to lean into that, because this isn't something that is easy to mentally address. And so choose hopeful engagement instead. I think the last one, I kind of liked how this was phrased. If I put myself in the shoes of someone in power, what is the steps that they could take in the short term to achieve nuclear disarmament? In terms of Canada, if you were to place yourself into the leader's shoes of a Canadian government official, I would say engaging as a bridge builder. I'll talk a bit about it in a second with the next section, talking more specifically about Canada. But that is and has been Canada's biggest strength, is being a bridge builder between what seems to be opposing sides. And so that is where I would start. You need to start slowly. It's not going to fix itself overnight. And being persistent is another thing as well. This is multi-generations now that are involved in this conversation, and it will continue to be. So,
and thank you for that segue, Julie. And I will bring attention to some resources that were published. I believe it was by ICAN, by the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, actually on dealing with nuclear anxiety specifically recently. And these are available online for the individual, just for their own mental health, which of course is an important aspect of all this.